Welcome, everybody. So good to have you here today. I hope you're having a great weekend so far, and I'm so glad that you've included Parker Hill in your weekend. And it may be that you're new to this church, and if so, we're so glad to have you here. And it may not have occurred to you until now that we are one church in 3 different locations. And so one of the ways that we stay connected as a church is by leveraging technology to share the teaching so that we can learn together and grow together every single Sunday. So whether you happen to be joining us today on our Dixon City campus or in Wilkes-Barre or in Clarks Summit, I'm just glad that you're here as we launch this brand new series called Money Myths. And for the next few weeks, we're going to be addressing some of the lies that we believe in our culture when it comes to this subject. Now, I want to recognize the fact right up front that this is a subject that when you talk about it, it kind of makes people nervous, especially in church, because it is a somewhat personal and sometimes emotional subject. And I want you to know that as a church here at Parker Hill, we don't shy away from things that are sensitive or controversial. We just tackle them head on. And we need to talk about the subject of money because you talk about it. And you think about it all the time, and sometimes you fight about it in your family. And our culture is talking about it constantly. But more importantly, we talk about this subject around here because the Bible talks about it extensively. Jesus never shied away from this subject. In fact, Jesus talks about the subject of money and possessions more than he talks about the subject of heaven and hell put together. In fact, more than 15% of the words of Jesus recorded in the New Testament address this part of our lives because he knew it would be such a challenge for us. But what we're doing during this series is we're addressing some of the myths, some of the lies that our culture tends to believe and that we as Christians oftentimes tend to believe as well. And as I kind of set up the whole series, let me give you a foundational principle for myths, not just about money, but about any area of life, okay? It goes like this: a firm decision based on a flawed assumption will always lead to a wrong conclusion. In other words, you can make the most seemingly logical decision, but if you make that decision based on faulty information, flawed information, it's never going to lead you to the place that you want to go. It just will not go well for you. In fact, let me tell you a story about that. There was a guy by the name of John Brandick about 5 years ago who wasn't feeling well, and so he went to his doctor, and his doctor did some testing, and then he had a conversation with John and told him that he had pancreatic cancer, stage 4, untreatable. He had about 6 months to live. And so John did what many people, I think, would do. He, cashed out his pension fund. He sold his house, withdrew all the money from his savings accounts. And he didn't have a wife or children, so he would just start going on lavish vacations. And he bought very expensive gifts for all of his friends. And he spent money on fancy meals, maxed out his credit cards. And he got about 4 months into that and realized his symptoms were starting to subside. So he goes back to the doctor, and the doctor did a little bit more testing, and he met with him, and he said, "I've got some good news for you. You don't have pancreatic cancer after all. You just had an infection of the pancreas, and you're going to recover just fine." That was the good news. The bad news was that by that time, Mr. Brandick had spent virtually every penny he had. He ended up filing for bankruptcy. And he said this when he was interviewed in a newspaper. He said, "I was told that I had limited time to live, and I got rid of everything. My car, my clothes, everything. I just kept my burial outfit. I'm happy that I got a second chance at life, but this has ruined me financially." And the point is this: a firm decision based on a flawed assumption will always lead to a wrong conclusion. And in our culture, I believe that we have some deeply flawed assumptions when it comes to money. And when we make decisions based on those myths, on those assumptions, it always brings pain into our lives. It just does. See, some of you have been through a divorce. And one of the reasons you're no longer married is because of conflict over money. Some of you live with stress every single day of your life because of your financial situation. Some of you, if you were honest, you would admit that you have compromised your integrity at times for money. Some of you want to be generous, but you can't be. And if you were to take all of those problems and trace them all the way back, you would discover that the beginning point is believing a myth about money. So over the next few months, few weeks, we're going to address some of these lies that our culture tells us every single day and seek to replace them with the truth. Now, you may be here and you may be new to this church, and we may have already confirmed your worst suspicions about coming back to church because we're talking about money. But let me just say this, you can relax, okay? We already took the offering. We're not asking you for anything, and if you're new here, we don't want anything from you. In fact, today, I want something for you. I want something for all of us. And what I want for us is something that I think we all want, and that's contentment. Because today, we're addressing the first myth, and the first myth is this one. Here it is. I just need a little more. I just need a little more. If I had a little more, then I'd be happy. If I just had a little more, my problems would be solved. If I just had a little more, then everything would be right in my world. I just need a little more. And this is a myth that we hear every single day in subtle ways. It's all around us in our culture. It's like the air that we breathe. We are a culture that has been driven by the desire for more. In fact, let me illustrate that for you. I want you to think about something as simple as soft drinks, okay? So back in the day, if you wanted to get a soft drink, you basically had three options, okay? You had small, medium, and large. Nowadays, there are a lot more options, and there are bigger and bigger options, okay? So let me start down here on the end with the small one, with the gulp, okay? This is 20 ounces right here. Now, back in the late 70s, up until the late 70s, this was the largest size soft drink that you could get at McDonald's, 20 ounces. By the way, I don't know if you know this or not, but the human adult bladder holds about 20 ounces. I don't know why I told you that. Maybe it's too much information. But anyway, that's the gulp, okay? And that was enough. But eventually somebody came along and said, you know what? We need more than that. And so they came out with the big gulp. That's 30 ounces. And that was okay for a while, but then, the people at 7-Eleven said, you know what, I think we could really sell a lot more soda if we had something that had a little bit more. So they came out with the super big gulp. And then eventually it was the double gulp, which was actually the subject of legal action in New York City. And then the one down there on the end, I think they call that the extreme big gulp. That's like 64 ounces in that thing. That comes with a box of Depends undergarments right there. Okay, and so there's just this progression of more and more and more. And for me, this is a micro story of our culture. That we have something, but it doesn't quite satisfy, and so we want a little bit more, and for a little while that satisfies, but eventually that doesn't satisfy anymore, and there's this relentless pursuit of more. And you see that in other areas of life as well. Let me just give you some examples of this to help kind of make the point, to drive the point home. Do you know that back in the 1930s, the average woman had 9 outfits in her closet, okay? That was back in the 1930s, just 9. And now today, on average, a woman will have 30 outfits in her closet. Now, just to be fair, I couldn't find any statistics for men. But I'm sure if I could find the statistics, the trend would be pretty much the same for men. I'm sure of it, and I need to say that. Okay, let me give you another example. Think about the houses that we live in. Back in 1950, the average new house that was built was 983 square feet. Today, the average new house that's built is almost 2,500 square feet. And think about that. Back in the 1950s, people on average had much larger families, and yet we had much smaller houses. Now we have small families and big houses. And so you might think, well, with these big houses, we kind of rattle around in our big houses now, and we have more space than we need, but that's not true. In fact, today, 75% of garages in the United States of America have no room left in them for the car because of all the stuff we put in our garages, because we just got to have more, right? And then, you would think with our big houses and with our garages that are full of stuff, we'd have all the room that we need. But one of the businesses that has really exploded in recent years is the self-storage business. Today in the United States, there are 2.3 billion square feet of rentable self-storage space. Now, you may not have any concept of how much space that is, so let me help you understand that. That's 3 times the size of Manhattan. Okay, that's how much storage space we have in the United States of America. And in the last 20 years, the number of households have gone from 1 in 17 to 1 in 10 who actually rent a storage unit because we have so much stuff that we can't fit it all in our big houses and in our garages, so we have to actually pay money to put our stuff somewhere else. Now, that's just a few examples of what is so much a part of our culture, that pursuit of more. If I just had a little more money, if I just had a little bigger house, a little bit nicer car, a little bit nicer clothing, if I could just have more, then I would be satisfied. And I got to tell you something. This myth is destroying us. I think it's destroying us as a culture. It's destroying our families. It's destroying the church as a whole. Because we're in a pursuit of more, but we're getting more. It's just that we're getting more stressed and more busy and more strapped financially and more selfish and more distracted by all of it. And I think there's a better way to live. And as followers of Christ, if you're a Christian, we are called to live a different way. So let's attack the myth that says, I just need a little bit more. When you came in today, you should have received a connection card on the back of that. There's a place to take some notes and write some things down that you may want to remember and reflect on this week. And if you have a Bible with you or you have one on your phone, you can bring that up. And let me also encourage you when you leave here and go home to continue learning by using what we call app notes. You can get those on our Facebook page or on our website. It's a way to, throughout the week, continue reading and learning about today's subject. But every week during this series, we're going to keep coming back to one single chapter in the Bible. 1 Timothy chapter 6 is where we will begin every single week in this series. So let me give you some background to this part of the Bible in case you're new to the Bible. This book of the Bible is named after Timothy, who was a young man, probably in his 20s, who lived in the city of Ephesus in the first century, and he was a pastor. He was leading the churches there. And the church in Ephesus was growing very quickly. It had grown by hundreds of people. And so Paul, who was like the key leader in the early church, wanted to help train Timothy and give him some leadership training. But they didn't, and Paul wasn't there in Ephesus, and they didn't have video conferencing or webinars. So he writes him a letter. He writes him a couple of letters, actually. And these letters are full of instructions for Timothy about how to lead the church and how to help these new believers, these new Christians, understand what it means to be a follower of Christ. And in chapter 6, he gives Timothy some instructions about how to lead these new believers when it comes to this area of their lives. And I think here in this chapter is some of the most amazing wisdom in the Bible about money. And the 5 verses we're going to look at today specifically address this myth that says, I just need a little bit more. So if I could summarize everything that we're going to read in these next 5 verses, it would be this. God has blessed me with more than I need. And if you remember nothing else today, remember that. We'll come back to that statement at the end. God has blessed me with more than I need. Let's jump in. Pick up here in verse 6. Paul's writing to Timothy, and he says this. He says, godliness with contentment is great gain. Great gain means great profit, or it could mean great wealth. In other words, the richest people in the world are not Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or Donald Trump, okay? The richest people in the world are not the 3 families that just won the Powerball drawing. The richest people in the world are people who have a deep and authentic relationship with God, godliness, and also have peace within their hearts, contentment. Godliness with contentment is great gain. Now let me stop and talk a little bit about that word contentment, because I think it's easily misunderstood. And when we talk about contentment, at least from a Bible perspective, contentment doesn't mean apathy, it doesn't mean complacency, it doesn't mean laziness. In fact, the Bible actually encourages us to work hard, to plan well, to make good money, to manage it well. None of those things are wrong. Those things are all good. But the thing is, we must do those things with the right motivation and do those things always with a spirit of contentment. So let me give you a definition for contentment, and I'll take kind of a roundabout way of getting there, okay? Let me start with a question, okay? Here's the question. Who is more content? The man with $10 million or the man with 10 children? Who's more content, the guy with $10 million or 10 kids? All right, here's the answer. The man with 10 children, because he Unlike the other guy, doesn't want any more. Okay? So here's a definition of contentment. Contentment means this. It means not being driven by wanting more. Contentment is the freedom from that incessant drive to never be satisfied and to always want more. Contentment is the freedom to live life knowing that my self-worth is not based on my net worth. And let me go back to verse 6 again, because I want you to see something here. It says, godliness with contentment is great gain. In other words, there is an inherent connection between godliness and contentment. I really don't think you can separate those two things. Because here's the thing, we live in a culture that has increasingly abandoned God. And yet there's an emptiness, I believe, in every single human heart that can only truly be fulfilled in a relationship with our Heavenly Father. And so in a society that has largely abandoned God, what we do then is we try to fill that emptiness, a spiritual emptiness, with material things, because we've forgotten that godliness with contentment is great gain. But those material things, they never quite satisfy us, do they? I was watching a few years ago a very interesting documentary. It was a documentary on the advertising industry. It was entitled The Persuaders. And it came out about 10 years ago, but I want to show you about 2 minutes of this documentary because I think it describes in a very powerful way how we as a culture have come to depend on material things for spiritual meaning. Okay, watch this with me. It's very interesting. As I was watching that, I couldn't help but think of the words of Jesus in Luke chapter 12 when he said this. He said, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. In other words, your life, the meaning in your life, the purpose in your life will never be found in the abundance of things or even in money. You'll never find meaning there. In fact, there's been a lot of research that's been done about this and that has really verified the words that Jesus spoke, 2,000 years ago. I was reading a book entitled Your Money or Your Life, and the authors, in preparing to write this book, did some research. They got 1,000 people, and they began to ask them a series of questions. And the first thing they asked them to do was to rate their happiness on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being frustrated with life, and 5 being absolutely joyous in life, and number 3 just being kind of acceptable. And so they had these 1,000 people rate where they felt their life was at, and then they looked at their answers and compared their answers to their income level, because they intentionally chose people with annual incomes ranging between $20,000 and $200,000 for this particular study, because they wanted to see the correlation between happiness and money, happiness and income. And when they got the results back, what they found out that was across the board, regardless of income level, everybody answered in a range between 2.6 and 2.8. In fact, at the highest income, the answers were down around 2.6, just below, acceptable, which was mind-blowing to them. It didn't matter what income somebody had between $20,000 to $200,000. They felt pretty much the same about life. And then they took it a step further and they asked the people involved in this research, just from an income perspective, whatever money could add to that, what would it take in terms of income to move you from here to at least a 4 or greater? And without fail, everybody in the study said, well, I think that would help if I just had a little bit more, and pretty much everybody came in at about the 50% range. Like people making $20,000 said, I think if I had 30, I could get up there. The people making 50 said, if I had $75,000 a year. The people making, $200,000 a year, I think I could get there if, I just had $300,000 a year. But here's what I will guarantee you. If somehow the people in that study, in that research study, got that 50% increase in their income, I think you could come back and do this study a few months later and discover that it really hadn't made all that much difference, at least not in the long term. And we know that, right? Maybe you get a big raise sometime or you get a windfall of money and you're like, wow, I can't believe it. This is so great. Our problems are solved. What are we going to do with all this extra money? And then a couple months later, it's like, how come we're broke again? Like, where'd all that money go? Like, we know that it doesn't do it for us. Now, there's nothing wrong with working hard and earning money, and my hope for all of you is that you'll experience God's blessing in this area of your life. But you got to remember something, That is not where meaning and fulfillment will ever be found in life. Godliness with contentment is the greatest gain there is, and that will help us to keep things in perspective. It's just a myth to think if I have a little bit more, I'm going to be okay. It's a myth. Now, living in this culture, we forget that really quickly. You'll walk out the doors of whatever campus you're on today, you're going to start being bombarded with messages that will undo everything that you're thinking about right now. So I want to give you a couple of things to remember. Okay, there are two things here that if we can remember these things, it will help us to live in a spirit of contentment. And the first thing we got to remember is this: we got to remember what is eternal. So Paul goes on writing to Timothy, and he says, listen, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. And we all know this, don't we, right? You know, we start out life with nothing, and whatever we gain during our lifetime, it all stays here when we go. And no matter what you have, when you leave this world, you're going to leave this world the same way as everybody else, naked and broke. We don't take anything with us. And as I've said before, you know, life can be kind of like a game of Monopoly, right? When I was a kid, I used to love to play Monopoly with my siblings, and honestly, I was pretty good at it. And I loved the thrill of getting the properties, and then you get the whole set of properties, and then you build the houses, right? And then you upgrade the houses to hotels, and then you wait until some poor sucker lands on your property and you collect those rents. And then eventually one of my siblings would get to the point where they were kind of out of money and they'd want a loan, right? And I'd say, no way, you know, you either pay up or I'm foreclosing and you give me all your properties. And then eventually I'd be the last man standing, and I would own everything, right? Every inch of the board. It was great. I loved it. But then they put everything back in the box, right? The game was over, and they put it all, and I didn't want it to go back in the box. I wanted to leave it out on the table so everybody could see it for the next week or two. I wanted to bronze it, right, as a memorial to my achievement. But that's not how it works. It all goes back in the box. You know, all the properties, all the hotels, all the houses, all that wonderful monopoly money, and like John Ortberg says, it all goes back in the box, and that's how your life is, right? Eventually you're going to die. And everything you have, it just goes back in the box. And you leave this world with nothing in your hand, carrying only what you possess in your heart, which is why Jesus said, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and yet lose his own soul? And so every day we've got to remind ourselves what is eternal, what is not eternal. Again, that doesn't mean you shouldn't own possessions. Doesn't mean you shouldn't enjoy your possessions. It just means you better not get too attached to them. And it means you better not pursue that stuff at the expense of what really matters in life, which is loving God and loving others. Remember what is eternal. Second thing to remember is this: remember what is essential. And Paul, in writing to Timothy here, gives us great clarity on this. He says, but if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. In other words, here's what you need. Everything else is what you want. You got food. You got clothing, you got a place to sleep at night, you have everything you need. Everything else is a luxury. Everything else is a want. Everything else is a convenience. And we tend to forget that. And we got to remember this every single day, because we live in this culture that tends to blur the lines between what is a need and what is a want. And so as an American, you know, I can go home and I can open up my refrigerator, and I can look in my fridge, and there's food in there. I actually have some options, but I can look at it and then close the refrigerator door, and then I can say, honey, we got nothing to eat. We got to go out. Like, we need some food around this joint, right? Or a person of a certain gender can go to the closet, and there's all kinds of jeans and sweaters, and there's dresses, and there's lots of shoes, and this particular person can walk out of the walk-in closet and say, man, I got nothing to wear. Or, you know, guys, you can sit down in front of the TV and you got like the mega sports package on your TV, and you got 500 channels, and you got the DVR, and your cable payment is like a car payment every month, and you sit there and you flip through the channels and you say to yourself, man, oh man, there's just nothing to watch. Because here's the problem as Americans: we tend to see nothing where there's a whole lot of something, because we forget what we really need and how much we have, and we blur this line between needs and wants. And I'll tell you, one of the best ways to remember this is to get engaged with people in the rest of the world. Most of you know that I have a 19-year-old daughter who's spending 9 months in South Africa, and she's serving there in a mission school. This is a picture of her with some of the kids that she teaches. And one of the ways that she keeps everybody updated on what's happening in her life is she keeps a blog. And I read her blog on Christmas Eve, and I just got to share it with you because I thought it was just so profound. Here's what she did and what she wrote about on Christmas Eve. She said, when most people think of Christmas gifts, they think of Lego sets and Barbie dolls. And there's nothing wrong with that. But for these kids, a brown paper bag with chips, 2 sweets, a whistle, and a lollipop meant the world. It may not sound like much to us, but to see how thankful they were for their little brown bags totally filled my heart. My favorite story of the day was seeing an older woman struggling to ask for a little brown bag for herself. I ran up to the group and grabbed one, ran back and handed it to her. That paper bag brought tears to her eyes, and she just reached out and hugged me. It was beautiful. And she says it was a great reminder of how the smallest gifts can mean the most to someone who has so little. And see, our problem is, and we're going to talk about this next week, that we have so much, and so we don't appreciate how much we have. So when that discontentment begins to rise up in your heart, remember what is eternal and remember what is essential. In fact, I want to recommend a book to you. The book is entitled More or Less. It's written by a guy named Jeff Schinnebarger. One of our other pastors, Paul McGinnis, recommended this to me, and I read it. I would recommend it to you. It's an incredible book if you really want to think about your life through the lens of what really is essential and what is enough. And I'll talk a little bit more about this next week, but just some fascinating ideas here, some things that you actually could put into practice. So buy a copy of that and read it, especially with your family, especially if you struggle sometimes with contentment. Okay, let's wrap up here with verses 9 and 10, because in the last couple of verses of this passage, there's really a powerful warning that's given to us about the dangers of believing the myth that says, I just need a little bit more, and what can happen in our lives when we allow that to drive us, okay? So verse 9, it goes on to say this, those who want to get rich, and by the way, you got to read that carefully. It doesn't say those who are rich. There's nothing wrong with wealth. We'll talk more about that next week. About the idea of being rich and is that okay. Nothing wrong with wealth as long as you acquire it properly, as long as you handle it well, as long as it doesn't get its talons into your heart. This isn't talking about people who are rich. It's about contentment. It's about people whose driving goal in life is just to get more. Because rich it's hard to define. It's always way out there, okay? So those who want to get rich, what happens to them? They fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. Man, there's some strong words there. That is a strong warning. He goes on to say this, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Now again, it doesn't say here that money is a root of all kinds of evil. Money is neutral. Money is a tool. And it's a tool that can be used to do some very good things. Money can feed a hungry person. Money can build a home for a homeless person. Money can educate a child who otherwise would not be educated. Money isn't the problem. It's the love of it that is at the root of all kinds of trouble in this world and all kinds of trouble in our lives. And it goes on to say this. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. And so he's talking here about people who are legitimate followers of Christ who begin to fall in love with that myth that says, I need a little bit more, and it just damages them spiritually and otherwise. So this is a wake-up call. This is a warning to all of us about what can happen. See, this pierced themselves with many griefs, this is the businessman who finally makes it to the top but loses his family in the process. This is about the kids who grow up feeling not valued at all by their parents because their parents are both working crazy hours to maintain a lifestyle that they really can't afford. This is the husband and wife who get a divorce because they overspend so much and create so much stress that their marriage can't handle it. So many people are piercing themselves with many griefs because of this myth of more. Let me show you a picture, interesting picture here of an 18-month-old little boy. His name is Colin. And interesting news story last year. Colin was out with his grandma. They were shopping. And he found one of those machines, the claw machines, that have the stuffed animals in the claw where you try to pick them out. He wanted one so bad, and she wasn't going to spend the money. So he figured out how to get through the little door where the animals come out when you win one. He climbed in there, and he climbed up in the machine. And he ended up being trapped in there. He couldn't get back out. They actually had to call the fire department to get the kid out of the machine. And I read that story, and I saw that picture, and I thought to myself, that's a lot of people in our culture. We go after those things that seem so attractive to us. In our pursuit of more, we end up trapped. We end up being held captive to our possessions, held captive to our debt, held captive to our selfishness, held captive to all the demands that come with that because we think that more will make us happier. And we end up getting more, but it ends up just being more stress and being more tired and more broke and more disappointed and more selfish. And I think this myth is doing great, great damage in our culture. So as a part of this series, we want to offer you a tool to help you in this whole area because I know it's such a struggle in our culture. So we've got an event coming up tomorrow night. It's called the Financial Learning Experience, featuring a friend of ours named Joe Sangl. He's a very captivating speaker, and he's incredibly wise on the issue of personal financial management, travels around the country and does this. We had him here last year, and everybody loved it. It was very, very helpful. So this is happening tomorrow night, Dixon City campus, beginning at 6:30, but you can come a half hour early because we're going to give you a light meal if you're coming right from work. So you come at 6, we'll feed you. There's no charge for the event. And if you have kids, you bring your kids with you, and we'll watch your kids during the event as well. And this doesn't cost you anything. The reason we do this is because we want to help you avoid the pitfalls and the grief that so many people in our culture get caught up in. We want to help you win with your finances. And maybe at the beginning of a new year, one of your resolutions is to get this figured out and kind of get control of your finances. So we want to help you with that. So here's how you sign up. On the connection card that you received when you came in, there's a box on one side that you can check. It says Other. Fill in the blank and just write FLE. Check the box Other, fill it in, FLE. And then on the other side, give us your name and tell us how many kids you're bringing with you so we can plan for that. Tear that off, turn it in at the Next Steps area on your campus. Or when you leave today, we'll give you a card and you can register online for that free event. Okay? So myth number one in the series is this: I just need a little more. Now, the best way to combat a myth is with the truth. So over the next few weeks, we're going to be working on a collective confession here at Parker Hill. We're going to give you a phrase at a time. It's going to build each week. But the phrase for this week, you've already heard it, is simply this: God has blessed me with more than I need. And when you feel that sense of discontentment beginning to rise up in your heart, when you're hearing those voices of our culture that just keep saying more, just say this to yourself: God has blessed me with more than I need. In fact, let's say this together on all 3 campuses. I want you to say it like you mean it. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. God has blessed me with more than I need. And He really has. And we're going to talk more about that next week. And we're going to close in just a minute with one more song. I'm going to have the band come back up to the platform on every campus right now. And we're going to close by singing a song called Christ is Enough. And there's a phrase in there that you'll hear several times. It says, Christ is enough. Everything I need is in you. And I want you to listen to these words from the Bible in Hebrews chapter 13. It says, keep your lives free from the love of money, from the myth that says, I just need a little bit more. And be content with what you have. And here's why. Because God has said, never will I leave you, and never will I forsake you. And I believe that when your deepest, innermost needs are being met in an authentic relationship with your Heavenly Father, then all the stuff of this world that we run after will no longer seem nearly as attractive to you, because Christ will be enough. Let me pray with you and then we'll close. God, I thank you that the one debt that we never could have afforded to pay and we never could have afforded is the debt of our sin, and you paid that on our behalf. Thank you for your love. Thank you for your forgiveness. Thank you for your grace in our lives. And may we respond to that free gift by recognizing that the greatest gift we can give back to you is to put you first in our lives. We know, God, that you are most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in you. And may you be our ultimate satisfaction in this world and not all the stuff of this world. May you be enough for us. I pray that in Christ's name. Amen.